There's a chilling moment in history when the line between justice and the supernatural blurs, when the scales of fate seem tipped by an unseen hand. Picture this: a conqueror who spent his life drowning cities in blood, suddenly struck down by a fever so violent his own doctors fled in terror. Or a tyrant who built his empire on cruelty, only to watch his palace crumble in flames the very night he celebrated his greatest victory. These aren't just coincidences. They're moments that make you wonder, was something more at work? Across centuries and civilizations, there are stories so bizarre, so eerily perfect in their timing, they defy explanation. This is the realm of divine retribution, where the wicked face punishments that feel tailor-made by forces beyond our understanding. Today, we're diving into 30 of the most unbelievable cases where history and legend collide. From ancient curses that toppled kingdoms to plagues that spared the innocent and targeted only the guilty, these tales will leave you questioning everything. Imagine a pirate king swallowed by the sea moments after mocking the gods, or a greedy noble's fortune vanishing overnight, replaced by a swarm of locusts. These stories aren't just about karma, they're about moments so uncanny they've been whispered about for generations. Was it chance or something far older, far darker, lining up the pieces with terrifying precision? You're about to embark on a journey through time where justice wears many faces, some merciful, others merciless. We'll walk the ruins of cities struck by heavenly fire, decipher warnings carved into temple walls, and meet figures who dared to defy the divine, only to meet endings so dramatic they became legends. Whether you're a skeptic or a believer, one thing's certain: by the end, you'll never look at history or fate the same way again. So lean in close. The past has a way of repeating itself, and sometimes it delivers a message we're meant to hear. The air inside the tomb was thick with dust and the weight of 3,000 years when Howard Carter first held his lamp up to the crack in the doorway. Gold glittered back at him, the untouched treasures of King Tutankhamun. But as the world celebrated the greatest archaeological discovery of the century, whispers began. A curse, ancient and hungry, had been awakened. Lord Carnarvon, the expedition's financier, died just months later. The cause, a mosquito bite on his cheek, infected, then fatal. But here's where it gets strange. At the exact moment of his death in Cairo, the lights across the city flickered and died. Back in England, his dog howled once and dropped dead. Then the others fell like dominoes. Arthur Mace, one of Carter's closest colleagues, complained of exhaustion and faded away without explanation. George J. Good, a wealthy visitor to the tomb, succumbed to a fever within days. Even Carnarvon's half-brother, who'd had no connection to the dig, died abruptly from blood poisoning. Newspapers screamed of the mummy's curse, pointing to an inscription supposedly found near the tomb's entrance. Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king. But was it really supernatural vengeance? Skeptics have answers. The tomb's air, sealed for millennia, could have bred deadly molds or bacteria. Carnarvon's health was already fragile. A car crash years earlier left him susceptible to infection. And that ominous inscription, many archaeologists insist it was never there. Yet the coincidences pile up. Of the 58 people present when the tomb was opened, 8 died within a decade. Carter himself lived another 16 years, but his canary wasn't so lucky. On the day of the discovery, a cobra slithered into its cage and devoured it. In Egypt, cobras weren't just snakes, they were symbols of pharaonic wrath. So where does that leave us? Science can explain the deaths, but not the eerie patterns. Maybe the real curse was fear itself, a self-fulfilling prophecy that preyed on guilty minds. Or maybe, just maybe, some doors are meant to stay closed. One thing's certain: when the last survivor of the expedition died in 1970, their obituary reads simply, "The curse is over." The tomb, though, still keeps its secrets. Rome had seen cruelty before, but never like this. Emperor Caligula began his reign as a golden hope, the beloved young prince who promised to restore dignity to the empire. Within months, the mask slipped. Whispers of madness slithered through the marble halls as he declared himself a living god, demanding worship from senators and citizens alike. Statues of Jupiter were beheaded across Rome, replaced with his own likeness. He forced parents to watch their children's executions, then invited them to dine with him the same evening. The Tiber ran red with his whims, but it was his mockery of the divine that would echo loudest in history's judgment. The omens came first. Lightning struck the capital on the anniversary of his ascension, a day meant for celebration. The sea froze overnight at Ostia, trapping ships in unnatural stillness. Most chilling, the night his favorite horse, Incitatus, was appointed a priest in his temple. As the Senate bowed to a stallion, a comet blazed across the sky. Even the stars, it seemed, recoiled. Then came the laughter. At a banquet, Caligula threw back his head and cackled uncontrollably for hours. When asked why, he gasped between fits, "I'm imagining your throats being cut." His end was as brutal as his reign. The Praetorian Guard, men who'd sworn to protect him, turned their blades on him in a shadowy corridor beneath the palace. 30 wounds later, his body was dumped like rubbish, but the strangest detail, his assassins struck during a festival honoring Jupiter, the very god he'd mocked. As his blood pooled on the tiles, a thunderclap shook Rome without a cloud in sight. Within hours, his loyal wife and infant daughter were also dead, their skulls crushed against a wall. Historians argue whether Caligula's fate was divine retribution or the inevitable collapse of a tyrant. But consider this, his name wasn't erased from monuments like other disgraced emperors. Instead, every statue of him was systematically decapitated, mirroring how he'd treated Jupiter's images. Even in death, the pattern held. The man who played God was reduced to a headless relic, while Rome whispered of curses fulfilled. Sometimes justice wears the face of poetic irony. Athens in 430 BCE was a city drunk on power. Fresh off decades of victory against Persia, its navy dominated the Aegean, its philosophy shaped the ancient world, and its democracy stood as a beacon until pride curdled into hubris. When Sparta challenged their dominance, the Athenians laughed. Their walls stretched all the way to the sea, their storehouses overflowed with grain. They called themselves untouchable. Then the ships arrived from Egypt carrying not treasure but death. The plague began subtly, a headache here, a fever there, but within days bodies piled in the streets. Thucydides, who survived it, described horrors that feel unnervingly modern. Victims coughing blood as lesions ate their skin, the stench of burning corpses clogging the air, survivors losing fingers and toes to gangrene. Even birds avoided the city, but what truly shattered Athens wasn't just the disease, it was the collapse of everything they believed made them superior. Their vaunted democracy, leaders died mid-speech, their military might, triremes sat anchored as crews perished, their piety, temples became mass graves. Here's where history twists the knife. As the death toll climbed, the Athenians remembered their sacrilege. Just years earlier, they'd seized treasury funds meant for the gods to fund their wars. They'd mocked Spartan envoys who warned of divine wrath. Now, the very walls they'd boasted about trapped the sickness like a sealed tomb. Survivors whispered of omens, statues sweating blood, wolves howling inside city gates. The Oracle of Delphi had warned that a Dorian war will come, and with it pestilence. Dorian, the bloodline of Sparta. Modern scientists identify the culprit as typhus or Ebola like filoviruses, but ancient Athenians saw a pattern too precise to ignore. The plague spared Sparta entirely. It burned hottest in Piraeus, where those sacrilegious treasury ships docked. And when it finally faded after 5 nightmarish years, it left not just half the city dead, but their faith in progress gutted. Pericles, their golden leader, succumbed. his famed funeral oration ringing hollow as Athens descended into paranoia and mob rule. The eerie lesson: hubris has consequences. Whether you call it divine retribution or the universe correcting its balance, the plague of Athens stands as a grim mirror, a reminder that walls, physical or metaphorical, can't shield arrogance from reckoning. And sometimes the price of forgetting that lesson isn't just paid in gold or pride, but in the very air we breathe. The sky above the Jordan Valley was clear that morning, no different from 1,000 others before it. Merchants haggled in Sodom's markets, children played near Gomorrah's gates, and if anyone noticed the strangers arriving at sunset, they paid no mind. But by dawn, both cities were gone, not just conquered or abandoned, erased. The book of Genesis describes fire raining from heaven, a cataclysm so complete, Lot's wife became a pillar of salt for the crime of looking back. It's one of the most infamous divine punishments in history, but beneath the layers of moral allegory lies a mystery that's fascinated archaeologists for centuries. Start with the science. The Dead Sea region sits on the Great Rift Valley, a tectonic hotspot where earthquakes and flammable methane gas seeping from the ground could create the perfect storm for disaster. In 2015, researchers found evidence of a massive meteor airburst near Tall El Hammam, a site many believe could be Sodom. The explosion, they estimate, was 1,000 times more powerful than Hiroshima's atomic blast, instantly incinerating everything in its path. Pottery shards melted into glass, buildings vaporized, and the blast's heat would have matched Genesis's description of brimstone and fire. Even the salt-heavy soil could explain Lot's wife's fate. A sudden surge of superheated brine might have encased her body in a macabre preservative shell. Yet the story persists not just as geology, but as a warning. Ancient writers framed Sodom's sin as more than mere debauchery. It was the cruelty of a society that criminalized kindness. Jewish texts describe Sodomites torturing visitors who showed compassion to the poor. The cities weren't destroyed for private vices, but for creating a culture where mercy was punishable by death. That's why the tale echoes across religions. Even the Quran recounts Allah's command to leave behind this community steeped in wrongdoing. Modern excavations add chilling layers. At Bab ed-Dirchare, believed to be Gomorrah's outskirts, archaeologists found charred remains of a massive Bronze Age city, abandoned around 1900 BCE. The destruction layer shows signs of extreme heat, but no signs of battle. People didn't flee, they were caught mid-meal, their last supper preserved in ash. Nearby, strange sulfur balls were discovered, matching the biblical brimstone. Natural, possibly, but the timing aligns eerily with Abraham's legendary bargaining session with God, where he pleads for the cities to be spared if even 10 righteous souls could be found. Perhaps the real power of Sodom's story isn't whether fire fell from heaven, but why we keep telling it. Every generation finds its own parallels, whether Pompeii's ruins or the ashes of Hiroshima. The tale endures because it asks a question we still struggle to answer. When a society celebrates its own cruelty, is destruction inevitable? Or is the greater miracle that sometimes, as with Lot's family, a few are allowed to walk away? The ocean was calm the night the Titanic disappeared beneath the waves, a mirror so still. Survivors swore they could see the stars reflected twice, once in the sky and once in the black water swallowing the ship whole. To the world, her sinking was a tragedy of engineering arrogance, but to some, it was something far darker, a reckoning. Years before the ship's doomed voyage, a novel titled Futility told the story of a massive, unsinkable ocean liner named Titan. Its fate, struck by an iceberg and lost with nearly all hands. The parallels were too precise to ignore. Similar names, nearly identical size, even matching routes across the North Atlantic. When the real Titanic met its end, copies of the book sold out overnight as people whispered about prophecy or warning. Even the ship's design seemed to taunt the heavens. The White Star Line's managing director famously declared Titanic practically unsinkable. a phrase newspapers quickly stripped of its cautious qualifier. Passengers boasted of bringing their automobiles aboard to drive off in New York, a statement dripping with the era's blind faith in progress. Then came the omens. Sailors muttered about the lack of a christening ceremony, a maritime tradition believed to bless a vessel's journey. During the voyage, crewmen reported an unsettling number of malfunctioning compasses, while first-class passengers described an unshakable sense of dread in the days before the iceberg struck. One survivor, Second Officer Charles Lightoller, would later write of a strange stillness that fell over the ship moments before impact, as if the sea itself was holding its breath. What truly fuels the divine retribution theory, though, isn't just the eerie coincidences. It's who survived and who didn't. Among the lost was John Jacob Astor, the richest man aboard, who'd recently divorced his wife to marry a teenager half his age, a scandal that made headlines worldwide. Also perished Benjamin Guggenheim, who changed into evening wear to die like a gentleman, and Isidore Straus, co-owner of Macy's, who refused a lifeboat seat while women and children remained. Their deaths felt like cosmic counterweights to their wealth and privilege. Meanwhile, in a twist that raised eyebrows, every single child traveling first and second class survived, while 70% of those in steerage drowned. Was it luck or something more ominous? Science, of course, offers rational explanations: brittle steel hull plates, rushed construction, a moonless night that hid the iceberg until it was too late. But history remembers more than facts, it remembers symbols. The Titanic wasn't just a ship. She was a floating monument to an era that believed technology could conquer nature, that luxury could insulate against disaster. Her wreck still sits 2.5 miles down, a carcass picked clean by time and pressure. Maybe that's the real lesson here, not that the gods punish hubris, but that the universe has a way of reminding us, sometimes gently, sometimes with an iceberg's jagged edge, that no creation, no matter how grand, gets to rewrite the rules of consequence. The fumes rising from the earth at Delphi weren't just intoxicating, they were divine. Pilgrims from across the ancient world climbed the slopes of Mount Parnassus, hearts pounding as they approached the stone temple where a single woman sat atop a tripod, breathing in the sweet, sickly vapors that twisted her words into prophecy. The Oracle of Delphi didn't speak in riddles by accident. The gods demanded ambiguity. And when King Croesus of Lydia, the richest man in the world, came seeking answers, he learned the hard way that fortune bends to no mortal, not even a king draped in gold. Croesus had every reason to be confident. His kingdom overflowed with wealth, streams ran thick with electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, and his capital Sardis gleamed like a mirage. But when Persia's young Cyrus the Great began swallowing neighboring kingdoms, Croesus sought the oracle's guidance. His question was straightforward: should I wage war against Persia? The response that echoed through the temple's cavernous halls would become legendary. If you cross the river Halys, you will destroy a great empire. Croesus took it as a green light. What he didn't realize, the empire destined to fall was his own. The details of his downfall read like a tragic punchline. His army marched east, crossed the Halys, and met Cyrus's forces in a battle so indecisive, both sides retreated by nightfall. But Croesus, ever the strategist, decided to disband his troops for winter, assuming warfare paused with the seasons. Cyrus had no such traditions. The Persians attacked mid-blizzard, sacking Sardis and capturing Croesus alive. As flames engulfed his palace, the defeated king finally understood the prophecy's cruel twist. Yet the story doesn't end with his humiliation. Greek historian Herodotus tells of Cyrus tying Croesus to a pyre, the fire licking at his sandals until a sudden downpour doused the flames. Some call it divine mercy, others another layer of the oracle's game. Because here's the chilling truth: the gods had answered Croesus honestly. He did destroy a great empire, his own. The real punishment wasn't the misinterpretation, but the lesson it carried. No amount of gold can buy clarity when pride clouds judgment. Delphi's warnings weren't unique to Croesus. Another king, asked if he'd win his war, was told a great kingdom will fall. He celebrated until his enemy's ally collapsed, leaving him outflanked. Even Alexander the Great, upon hearing the oracle refused to speak to him on an inauspicious day, dragged her by the hair until she gasped, "You are invincible." He left satisfied. She wasn't wrong. He died undefeated in battle. But at 32, his empire fractured like kindling. So was the oracle supernatural or simply shrewd? Modern geologists confirm ethylene gas seeped from Delphi's rocks, a compound known to induce trances. The priests, masters of reading geopolitical tides. But the deeper magic lay in the delivery. Prophecies weren't lies, they were mirrors reflecting the arrogance of those who sought them. Croesus didn't lose because the gods cursed him. He lost because he heard only what he wanted to hear, and in that, his story echoes far beyond ancient Lydia. Even today, the ruins of Sardis stand as a warning. When you ask the universe for answers, be ready to face the ones you didn't expect. The first symptoms arrived quietly: swollen lymph nodes, a fever that spiked without warning. Within days, bodies piled in the streets faster than gravediggers could bury them. By the time medieval Europe realized what was happening, the Black Death wasn't just a disease, it became a mirror held up to humanity's deepest fears. To the terrified masses, this wasn't biology, it was the wrath of a vengeful god. The year was 1347, and the world was about to learn a brutal lesson. When society fractures, the first casualty is always reason. Churches overflowed with penitents as priests preached that the plague was punishment for mankind's sins. But which sins? No one could agree. Some blamed greed, others lust. The only consensus was desperation. Enter the flagellants, men and women who marched from town to town, their bare backs crisscrossed with wounds from iron-tipped whips. They believed self-inflicted torment could spare them divine judgment. Their processions were hypnotic, chanting, bleeding, collapsing in the mud while onlookers wept. At their peak, the movement swelled to hundreds of thousands, yet the plague didn't discriminate between flagellant and skeptic. If anything, their open wounds and close quarters accelerated the spread. Then came the scapegoats. Rumors spread that Jews were poisoning wells to wipe out Christians. Never mind that Jewish communities were dying at the same horrific rates. Mob logic required a villain. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in a single day. In Mainz, 6,000 were slaughtered despite the local bishop's attempts to protect them. Pope Clement VI issued 2 papal bulls condemning the violence, calling it a madness fueled by fear. His words barely slowed the slaughter. Art from the period tells its own grim story. The Dance of Death frescoes showed skeletons leading kings, peasants, and popes alike into the grave, a stark reminder that mortality plays no favorites. In Vienna, artists painted the plague crucifix, showing Christ covered in sores like a plague victim. These weren't just macabre decorations, they were sermons in pigment. The message, death humbles all. Modern science, of course, reveals a simpler truth. The bacterium Yersinia pestis spread by fleas on rats, but try telling that to a world watching half its population vanish. The Black Death's real legacy isn't just the bodies, it's what it exposed about human nature. When faced with the inexplicable, we'll tear each other apart looking for someone to blame. And sometimes the darkest plagues aren't the ones that kill the body, but the ones that infect the mind. The silence in the canyon is what strikes you first, not an absence of sound, but the weight of centuries pressing down on abandoned stone. The Anasazi didn't just vanish, they left behind towering cliff dwellings tucked into sandstone alcoves, pottery shards painted with intricate black-on-white patterns, and kivas, ceremonial pits where the air still feels thick with whispered prayers. By 1290, these master builders of the American Southwest were gone. No war, no invasion, just empty homes and half-ground corn in abandoned mortars. To the Pueblo people who came after them, the answer was clear. The gods had turned away. Drought makes for a convenient culprit. Tree rings from the period tell a story of relentless aridity, 23 years with barely a drop of rain. Crops withered, game fled, and the Anasazi's sprawling trade networks, which once stretched from Mexico to the Rockies, collapsed like a house of cards. But here's the puzzle. Other southwestern cultures endured worse droughts without crumbling. The Hohokam dug vast irrigation canals, the Mogollon adapted. Why did the Anasazi, with their genius for storing water in cisterns and aligning buildings to capture rainfall, meet such a dramatic end? Then there's the darker thread. At sites like Cowboy Wash in Colorado, archaeologists unearthed human bones with cut marks identical to those found on butchered game. Pottery shards held traces of myoglobin, a protein found only in human muscle tissue. The evidence sparked a firestorm. Had the Anasazi turned to cannibalism in their final days? Some scholars argue it was ritualistic, a last-ditch effort to appease the gods. Others see starvation's grim hand, but Hopi and Zuni oral traditions passed down for generations speak of something more ominous. Their ancestors warned of the Anasazi's arrogance, how they meddled with forbidden magic, how their priests sought power beyond the natural order. The result, a curse that hollowed them out from within. One legend tells of a kiva where shamans conducted experiments with the fabric of reality. When they pierced the veil between worlds, something slithered through. Soon after, the people began vanishing, not in groups but one by one, as if plucked from existence. Others whisper of a great migration, not to escape drought, but to flee the wrath of the Catchinas, the ancestral spirits who'd withdrawn their protection. The cliff dwellings, perched precariously on canyon walls, weren't just practical, they were defensive. But against what? Modern science offers pieces of the puzzle, not the whole picture. Pollen samples show that in their final years, the Anasazi abandoned corn, their sacred staple, to grow drought-resistant prickly pear, a sign of pragmatism or desperation. At Choco Canyon, their spiritual center, astronomers find celestial alignments so precise they rival Stonehenge. Yet the grandest buildings were abruptly sealed, as if to imprison something inside. Today, park rangers tell of hikers who swear they hear drums echoing from empty kivas at twilight, or catch the scent of juniper smoke where no fire burns. The Anasazi's legacy isn't just a cautionary tale about climate change or societal collapse. It's a riddle carved into stone. How thin is the line between survival and sacrilege? Between innovation and hubris, their cliff palaces still cling to the rocks, windows staring like hollow eyes. Whatever they witnessed in their final days, the land hasn't forgotten. And neither, it seems, have the gods. The waves lapped gently against the hull of the Mary Celeste that December morning in 1872, a sound so ordinary it made the scene even more chilling. The day Gracia's crew spotted her first, a ghost ship drifting near the Azores, sails half set, lifeboat missing. Boarding her, they found breakfast still on the table, tea warm in the cups, and not a single soul aboard. No signs of struggle, no water in the hold, just 10 people vanished into thin air. Theories exploded like gunpowder. Some pointed to the cargo, 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol, a volatile load that could have sparked panic if fumes built up. But the barrels were intact. Others whispered of sea monsters, citing the ship's log's final entry, which noted passing near an underwater earthquake days earlier. Then came the darker tales: mutiny, murder, even time warps. The most persistent legend, a curse. The Mary Celeste had a habit of losing captains. Her first died before launch, another succumbed to illness mid-voyage. By the time Captain Briggs took command, sailors crossed themselves at her name. Yet the facts resist easy horror. Briggs was a devout family man who brought his wife and toddler aboard, hardly the type to court danger. The ship's papers and navigational tools were gone, suggesting a planned evacuation. But why abandon a perfectly seaworthy vessel? Modern researchers propose a false abandonment scenario, a faulty chronometer misled brigs into thinking they were near land, prompting a panicked launch into stormy seas. The lifeboat, overloaded, would have capsized instantly. The truth may never surface. What's undeniable is how the Mary Celeste became more than a shipwreck. She's a Rorschach test for our deepest fears. Rationalists see a cautionary tale about human error. Romantics see a portal to another dimension. And the Atlantic, she keeps her secrets as all good oceans do. The Mary Celeste sailed on for 12 more years under different owners, each meeting strange ends until she was finally wrecked deliberately for insurance money. Even in death, she refused to give up her ghosts. The morning of November 1st, 1755 began like any other All Saints' Day in Lisbon, church bells ringing, candles flickering before statues of saints, the faithful packing into crowded cathedrals. Then at 9:40, the ground convulsed. What followed wasn't just an earthquake, but a perfect storm of destruction. The initial tremors, estimated at nearly 9.0 in magnitude, lasted 10 minutes, toppling buildings onto worshippers. Then came the tsunamis, 30-foot waves surging up the Tagus River, drowning thousands who'd fled to the waterfront. Finally, fires erupted from overturned votive candles, merging into an inferno that burned for 5 days. By the time the smoke cleared, 85% of Lisbon's structures lay in ruins, and up to 100,000 souls were dead. To survivors, this wasn't just geology, it was the hand of an angry god. Preachers wasted no time connecting the dots. Lisbon had been Europe's wealthiest port, a city drunk on gold from Brazilian colonies and the slave trade. Its brothels and gambling dens thrived while the Inquisition tortured heretics in shadowy dungeons. From pulpits across Europe, priests declared the quake divine retribution for the city's dual sins of decadence and hypocrisy. Jesuit Gabriel Malagrida penned pamphlets claiming God had shaken the earth to its foundations to punish Lisbon's moral decay. The church organized public penance processions, blaming the disaster on everything from theater performances to women's fashions. Survivors were urged to view their suffering as purification, a twisted silver lining to the catastrophe. Enter Voltaire, the sharp-tongued philosopher who'd lost his lover in the disaster. His poem on the Lisbon disaster tore into this fatalistic thinking. Was then more vice in fallen Lisbon found, he wrote, than London where voluptuous joys abound. His famous line, all is well in God's plan, became a bitter mockery of the church's explanations. If this was divine justice, why did the quake destroy 30 churches but leave the red light district relatively untouched? Why perish infants in their cradles while corrupt officials survived? Voltaire's rage birthed modern existentialism, arguing that sometimes disasters are just disasters, senseless, random, and utterly indifferent to human notions of morality. The earthquake's aftershocks rippled far beyond Portugal's borders. Religious leaders across Europe fretted that their cities might be next. In Geneva, John Calvin's followers saw Lisbon as proof of Catholicism's corruption. Meanwhile, scientists like Immanuel Kant published some of the earliest treatises on seismology, an attempt to wrest control from the divine narrative. Even architecture changed. The new Lisbon rose with wider streets and earthquake-resistant Pombaline buildings, named after the pragmatic Marquis of Pombal who famously shrugged, "Now we bury the dead and feed the living." But perhaps the most haunting legacy lies in the ruins of the Carmel convent, whose collapsed arches were left standing as a memorial. The stone crucifix that survived the quake now tilts precariously over the wreckage, a silent question mark hanging over the entire event. Was it punishment or merely plate tectonics? A warning or the universe's cold indifference? 3 centuries later, Lisbon still hasn't answered, and maybe that's the point. Some disasters don't come with morals, they come with demands. Rebuild, remember, and resist the temptation to mistake suffering for meaning. Deep within the Smithsonian's vaults, behind bulletproof glass, rests a stone the color of a stormy twilight, a blue so intense it seems to swallow light. The Hope diamond weighs 45 carats, but its real heaviness lies in the whispers trailing behind it like a funeral shroud. Stolen from the eye of a Hindu idol in India, smuggled across continents in the belly of ships, and passed between owners like a poisoned chalice, this gem carries a ledger written in blood and madness. The curse's first victim, Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, the French merchant who pried it from the statue of Sita in the 1600s, legend says he was torn apart by wild dogs in Russia, a fitting end, some murmured, for a thief who'd angered the gods. But the diamond was just getting started. King Louis Roman XIV, the Sun King, had it recut into a symbol of royal grandeur, only to watch his dynasty crumble in revolutions and gruesome executions. Marie Antoinette, often wrongly blamed for wearing it, the gem was likely reset as a pendant for her, met the guillotine with her hair famously whitened by terror. Then came the Hope family, whose name now clings to the stone like an epitaph. Henry Philip Hope went bankrupt. His descendant Lord Francis Hope squandered his fortune on a scandalous actress and died penniless. Even those who merely touched it suffered. A Turkish sultan's entire harem drowned after his courtier gifted it to him. A Washington socialite, Evelyn Walsh McLean, bought it as a good luck charm, then lost her son to a car crash, her daughter to suicide, and her husband to another woman's bed. Science, of course, scoffs at curses. The diamond's infamous blue hue comes from trace boron atoms, not divine wrath. Its tragedies, coincidence amplified by selective memory. After all, most owners died peacefully, but who remembers them? Yet there's one detail that gives even skeptics pause. The stone glows blood red under ultraviolet light. Geologists attribute this to phosphorescence, but in the dim halls of the Smithsonian, where the diamond now sits quietly, that eerie glow feels like a warning. Maybe the real curse isn't supernatural, it's the human obsession with beauty that blinds us to its cost. The Hope diamond's last private owner, Harry Winston, mailed it to the Smithsonian in a plain brown box with 55-cent postage. No fanfare, no insurance, just a jeweler who'd had enough of its stories. Today, tourists press their noses to the glass, half hoping for a glimpse of its supposed power. But the stone just stares back, cold and fathomless, keeping its secrets as it has for centuries. Whether you believe in curses or not, one truth remains: some treasures burn brighter in legend than in light. And sometimes the weight of history is heavier than any jewel. The sun rose over Pompeii on August 24, 79 AD, as it had for centuries, golden and indifferent. Shopkeepers rolled up their awnings, children chased stray dogs through the forum's marble colonnades, and in the temple of Isis, priests lit incense to a goddess who'd already turned her back. No one noticed the mountain exhaling. By afternoon, Vesuvius split open like a rotten fruit, vomiting a column of ash 15 miles high. Pliny the Younger, watching from across the bay, described it as a pine tree of smoke, its shadow swallowing towns whole. But to the Pompeians choking on sulfurous air, this wasn't geology. It was judgment. Decades before the eruption, Rome's moralists had warned of Pompeii's excesses. Frescoes in the Villa of the Mysteries depicted rituals so lurid, archaeologists initially hid them from public view. Brothels advertised their services with explicit mosaics, while tavern walls bore graffiti boasting of drunks who'd dined like gods and vomited like dogs. Even the baths, supposedly places of cleansing, housed hidden rooms where elite men indulged in unheard of debauchery. When Seneca wrote of cities ripe for divine correction, everyone knew which city he meant. Then came the omens. Springs near Pompeii ran dry weeks before the eruption. Dogs howled incessantly. Livy recorded flocks of birds abandoning the region days prior, as if nature itself was evacuating. The plaster casts tell the real horror. Not skeletons, but voids in the ash spaces where bodies disintegrated, leaving hollows that archaeologists later filled with liquid plaster. A woman clutches a baby to her chest even as her jawbone detaches from the skull, seared by pyroclastic surges hot enough to vaporize flesh. A guard still stands at his post, helmet fused to his head by molten bronze. Most haunting, the ring lady, found curled in a cellar with her emerald-studded jewelry intact, wealth that couldn't buy her an extra breath. Roman historians spun the disaster as cosmic comeuppance. Tacitus claimed the mountain roared loudest when it engulfed Pompeii's amphitheater, a jab at the blood-soaked games held there. Petronius's Satyricon mocked the city's final feast, diners mistaking falling pumice for an exotic snowfall, unaware they were seasoning their last meal with volcanic glass. Even the positioning of bodies felt symbolic. Two lovers frozen mid-embrace near the gladiator barracks, their bones later revealed to be two men, a detail omitted from Victorian era exhibits to preserve decency. Modern volcanologists can pinpoint the pyroclastic flow's 300-mile-per-hour velocity or the 250 degrees Celsius heat that flash-cooked brains inside skulls. But science can't explain why Herculaneum's library survived almost intact, its scrolls carbonized yet legible, as if the gods wanted Rome to remember why it fell. Or why the ash preserved a loaf of bread stamped made by slave Felix, his pride immortalized alongside his doom. Vesuvius still smolders today, overlooking Naples' sparkling modernity. Locals hang portraits of San Gennaro in their windows, praying the martyr who once calmed the fire will intervene again. Perhaps the lesson isn't whether Pompeii was punished, but how easily we repeat its mistakes. The same bay that buried a city now hosts yachts of oligarchs. The same fertile slopes grow grapes for wines named Vesuvio, a toast to destruction dressed as luxury. The mountain sleeps but never forgets, and the plaster faces staring up from museum cases, they don't blink. The air in Béziers hung thick with the scent of crushed grapes that July morning in 1209, not that anyone would taste the year's wine. The city's sins, according to the papal legate Arnaud Amalric, were too ripe to ignore. Nestled in the heart of Cathar country, Béziers had become a haven for heretics who dared to reject Rome's authority. When the crusading army arrived at its gates, the demand was simple: hand over the 222 known Cathars hiding within or face annihilation. The townspeople refused. What happened next wasn't just a battle, it was a blood-soaked sermon on the darkest interpretation of divine justice. The Crusaders breached the walls within hours, their swords glinting under a pitiless sun. Panicked citizens, men, women, children flooded into the church of St. Mary Magdalene, clinging to the altar as if holy stone could shield them. It couldn't. Arnaud's knights butchered them where they knelt, 7,000 in a single hour. The slaughter spilled into the streets until the gutters ran crimson. When a soldier asked how to distinguish Cathar from Catholic, the legate's reply echoed through history: kill them all, God will know his own. By dusk, 20,000 lay dead, and the city burned so fiercely its smoke was seen from Marseille. But here's the twist: Béziers wasn't even a Cathar stronghold. Most victims were devout Catholics cut down for the crime of sheltering their neighbors. The real heresy, it seemed, was mercy. Arnaud justified the massacre as a divine purge, an act of holy violence to cleanse the land, and for a time it worked. The terror broke the region's spirit, paving the way for the Inquisition's iron grip. Yet the reckoning came quietly. Arnaud died years later, stripped of his titles, his name reviled even by fellow clerics. The church he defiled with bloodshed, rebuilt, but locals whisper that the new stones weep red during summer storms. What makes Béziers chilling isn't just the scale of violence, it's how easily faith became a license for atrocity. The Crusaders truly believed they were God's instruments, that paradise awaited those who slaughtered in his name. But history's verdict is merciless. When we claim to kill on heaven's behalf, we're often just confessing our own hunger for power. The stones of St. Mary Magdalene still stand today, their scars hidden under whitewash. The only epitaph that fits: God knew his own, and they were not the ones holding the swords. The first scream tore through the Salem jail in 1692, not from the accused, but from the accuser. young Ann Putnam Jr., whose testimony had sent 19 souls to the gallows, writhed on the stone floor, shrieking about specters clawing at her skin. By the time the witch trials ended, 25 people were dead, but the horror wasn't finished. It curled back like a noose around those who'd set the frenzy in motion. The Putnams, the most prolific accusers, would bury 7 family members within a decade, their crops withering to dust despite fertile soil. Reverend Samuel Parris, who'd stoked the panic from his pulpit, was driven from town by an angry mob, his own congregation. And Judge William Stoughton, who'd refused to apologize for the hangings, died alone in his bed, his will mysteriously vanishing so his estate passed to a despised nephew. Look closer at the accusers' fates and the patterns grow unsettling. Abigail Williams, the girl whose visions launched the trials, vanished from records by 1697, likely dead before turning 20. Mercy Lewis, who'd sobbed in court about witches pinching her with invisible fingers, gave birth to a stillborn child later claimed by locals to be marked with teeth. Even the town itself seemed cursed. Salem Village renamed itself Danvers to escape the stigma, but fire gutted its meeting house twice before 1720. Meanwhile, the descendants of the executed like Rebecca Nurse's family thrived, their orchards inexplicably spared by blights that ravaged neighbors' land. Historians chalk it up to trauma and guilt. The human mind, after all, can conjure its own punishments, but folklore whispers of stranger things. In 1712, a group of men dug up the grave of George Burroughs, the minister hanged as a witch. They sought his bones as a talisman against curses, only to find the corpse oddly preserved, lips parted as if mid-incantation. The men reburied him hastily. That same year, smallpox swept through Salem, sparing only households descended from the accused. Coincidence, perhaps. But in 1755, when lightning struck the courthouse where so many had been condemned, the bolt left a single word charred into the beam: repent. The trial's darkest irony lies in their final confession. Years later, Ann Putnam Jr., now a gaunt woman of 27, stood before her church and admitted she'd been deluded by the devil into accusing innocence. Her words were met with silence. No absolution came. She died 3 months later, her grave marked with a stone so plain, wind and rain erased its inscription within decades. Meanwhile, the hanging tree on Gallows Hill rotted from within, collapsing the year the last trial witness died. So was it divine retribution or the weight of collective shame? Science points to ergot poisoning from moldy rye bread as the spark behind the afflicted girl's hallucinations. Psychology notes how mass hysteria feeds on fear. But walk through Danvers today, and you'll still find bouquets of herbs left at the nurse homestead: rosemary for remembrance, mint for protection. The land remembers what history tries to forget. Whether you call it karma or conscience, some debts can't be buried. They grow roots, they whisper, and sometimes they collect. The sails of the Lion snapped tight as John White's ship cut through the August fog in 1590. 3 years had passed since he'd left Roanoke Island, since he'd kissed his newborn granddaughter Virginia goodbye, promising to return with supplies. Now, stepping onto the silent shore, he found the settlement eerily intact and utterly empty. Houses stood dismantled, their timbers carefully stacked. A single word was carved into the fort's gatepost: Croatoan. No cross, the agreed-upon distress signal. No bodies, just one cryptic clue and the whisper of the wind through abandoned fields. The 115 colonists, including White's own family, had vanished without a trace. Native tribes told conflicting stories. The Croatan, allies of the English, swore they'd watched the settlers pack up and march southward. But other accounts spoke of shadows moving through the pines at dusk, of a pale fire glimpsed near the shore the night the colony disappeared. The Secotan, who'd clashed with the newcomers, whispered of Mantio's curse, a reference to the Croatan translator who'd been baptized Christian, only to be later blamed for crop failures. Had the colonists offended spirits older than memory? Some point to their first winter when they desecrated a burial mound, scattering bones to search for gold. Others note the timing. Their disappearance coincided with the Panther's moon, a period some coastal tribes associated with vengeful spirits walking the earth. Archaeology offers fragments, not answers. In 2012, a patch of Elizabethan-era pottery surfaced 50 miles west of Roanoke near a Native American village. A decade later, researchers using ground-penetrating radar found a hidden fort beneath the island's soil, perhaps the real site of the doomed settlement. But the most chilling find came from a weather-worn rock discovered in 1937, etched with what seemed like a woman's plea. "Father, soon after you go for England, we came hither." Only misery and war, 2 years above the river, God save us. Experts dismissed it as a hoax until a second stone was found nearby, bearing the name Ananias Dare, White's son-in-law. Theories spiral from plausible to fantastical. Spanish records suggest Florida's governor sent assassins north to eliminate the Protestant colony. A surviving ship's log mentions spotting English children among the Chesapeake tribe years later. Then there's the Dare stones, dozens of engraved rocks that surfaced in the 1930s, telling a saga of starvation and betrayal, though most were likely forgeries. Modern linguists note Croatoan might not have been a location but a warning. The word echoes Croatan but also Cruadon, an old Gaelic term for bloody ground. Perhaps the truth lies between history and legend. In 1887, a hurricane unearthed Native American graves near Roanoke alongside rusted English swords. Local tribes refused to touch them, claiming they wept when handled. Today, the island's marshy silence feels heavier than mere abandonment. The colonists' wells, still drinkable after 4 centuries, ripple at dusk as if something below is stirring. DNA tests on present-day Croatans show European ancestry markers, but their oral traditions speak carefully of lost cousins who walked into the woods and forgot their names. Whatever happened, Roanoke's legacy isn't just a mystery, it's a mirror. The deeper we dig, the more we see our own fears reflected, of being swallowed by the wilderness, of promises broken, of becoming ghosts in someone else's story. The only certainty, some doors to the past open just wide enough to remind us they're still locked. The wind howled through Chicago's wooden alleyways on the night of October 8, 1871, carrying not just the scent of autumn leaves but something far more sinister. By dawn, 3 square miles of the city lay in smoldering ruins, 17,000 buildings reduced to ash, 300 dead, and nearly 100,000 left homeless. As survivors stumbled through the wreckage, clutching singed belongings and searching for loved ones, the preachers were already raising their voices. This wasn't just a disaster. They thundered from makeshift pulpits amid the rubble. It was divine retribution. Chicago, the Queen of the West, had grown too arrogant, too sinful. Her theaters, saloons, and brothels had invited the flames of judgment. One Baptist minister even published a pamphlet titled "The End of Sodom Again," listing the city's sins like a prosecutor tallying charges, gambling dens, corrupt politicians, and worst of all, the tolerance of vice. The fire, he declared, was God's way of purifying the wicked. Yet the most enduring myth of the blaze had nothing to do with Scripture. Catherine O'Leary, an Irish immigrant milking her cow in the barn behind her Decoven Street home, became history's unluckiest scapegoat. Newspapers claimed her lantern-kicking bovine ignited the inferno, a story so catchy it eclipsed the truth. In reality, the O'Learys were asleep when the fire started, and the Chicago Tribune later admitted they'd fabricated the tale to sell papers. The real cause was far more mundane and far more damning. A city built like a tinderbox, Chicago's rapid expansion had prioritized speed over safety: wooden streets, wooden sidewalks, even wooden roofs coated in tar. Drought had left the air parched for weeks, while firefighting efforts were hobbled by exhausted crews who'd battled a massive blaze just the day before. When flames leapt across the Chicago River, carried by embers on the wind, even the fireproof brick buildings stood no chance. The aftermath revealed another layer of irony. While preachers pointed to the flames consuming vice districts, the fire spared some of the most notorious brothels near Custom House Place. Meanwhile, working-class immigrant neighborhoods home to families like the O'Learys burned to the ground. The wealthy, who'd built stone mansions along the Gold Coast, watched helplessly as the fire ignored divine logic and marched northward, devouring churches, libraries, and orphanages with equal hunger. Science would later pin the blame on a perfect storm of negligence, a spark from a chimney, perhaps, or a careless smoker in the wrong hayloft. But the fire's true legacy isn't just in the ashes, it's in the lies we cling to when confronted with chaos. The O'Leary myth endured because it offered a simple villain. The preacher's sermons persisted because they fed our instinct to see order in catastrophe. Chicago itself, though, refused to play the penitent. Within 2 years, the city rose taller than ever, its new steel-framed skyscrapers a defiant middle finger to the heavens. The fire had scoured the ground, but not the spirit, and if that wasn't divine retribution, maybe it was divine permission. The cellar of the Yusupov Palace reeked of cheap wine and human sweat on the night of December 30th, 1916. Grigory Rasputin, the self-proclaimed holy man who'd clawed his way from Siberian peasant to the Tsar's inner circle, slumped at the table as his killers watched. They'd laced his cakes with enough cyanide to drop a horse, yet he kept eating. They'd shot him point blank in the chest, yet he rose like a marionette jerked upright by invisible strings. Prince Felix Yusupov, the aristocrat leading the assassination, would later describe Rasputin's final moments with the frantic horror of a man who'd awakened something older than bullets. He crawled toward me, bleeding black blood, and whispered, "You will all drown in blood," before we finally silenced him in the frozen never. Rasputin's corpse told its own macabre story. Pulled from the river 3 days later, autopsy reports noted lungs filled with water, proof he'd still been alive when tossed beneath the ice. His right arm was frozen upright, fingers curled as if mid-blessing or curse. But the real terror came later. Within 16 months, the Romanov dynasty collapsed in a haze of gun smoke and revolution. Tsar Nicholas, the man Rasputin had warned would lose his throne if he were killed, signed his own abdication papers in a railway car. The royal family, whom Rasputin had called his little doves, were herded into a basement in Yekaterinburg and executed by Bolsheviks, their bodies so mutilated, acid was poured over their faces to prevent identification. Even Yusupov's family wasn't spared. His wife Irina fled Russia penniless, while the palace where Rasputin died became a Soviet administrative building haunted by phantom chanting. Historians roll their eyes at the supernatural spin. The Romanovs were already teetering war fatigue, food shortages, and Nicholas's political incompetence had sealed their fate long before Rasputin's murder. But the timing chills the spine. The mystic's last written prophecy, sent to the Tsarina weeks before his death, read, "If I die by common hands, you and your children will live. If it's your kin who kill me, none of you will outlive me by 2 years." The assassins, nobles linked to the royal family, the Romanovs' execution date. July 17, 1918, exactly 23 months after Rasputin's drowning. Science offers cynical explanations. The cyanide might have been rendered inert by sugar in the cakes, and Rasputin's legendary resilience could have been undiagnosed epilepsy or alcoholism. Yet even Stalin allegedly kept Rasputin's sealed prophecy file in his desk, unopened, as if wary of its power. Today, the Neva's ice still cracks each December in the same jagged patterns recorded by witnesses in 1916. Coincidence, probably, but in a land where myths outlive empires, some truths slither beneath rational explanations like the river under the ice, dark, patient, and waiting to surface. The morning of June 30th, 1908 began like any other in the Siberian taiga until the sky split open. Reindeer herders near the Podcamonea-Tunguska River looked up to see a fireball streaking across the heavens brighter than the sun. Then came the explosion, a force so immense it flattened 80 million trees across 800 square miles. Windows shattered 400 miles away. Seismic waves circled the globe twice. The blast, estimated at 10 to 15 megatons, 1,000 times more powerful than Hiroshima, left no crater. Just a silent, scorched wasteland where the forest now pointed radially outward like spokes on a wheel of some unfathomable chariot. To the Evenki people, the Tunguska event wasn't a mystery, it was a reckoning. Their shamans spoke of Ogdi, the god of thunder, who'd grown wrathful at humanity's disrespect. Hunters had slaughtered too many animals without offering thanks. Trees were felled without permission from the spirits, the fireball, Ogdi's fist striking the earth. The charred, branchless trunks left standing at ground zero, lightning poles where the god had channeled his fury. The Evenki avoided the blast zone for decades, leaving offerings of tobacco and reindeer blood at its edges. Soviet scientists who later interviewed survivors noted their eerie calm. To the Evenki, the event was terrible but just, a divine reset. Western researchers, of course, reached for less poetic explanations. The lack of a crater pointed to an airburst, a meteor or comet fragment detonating 5 miles above the ground. Yet expeditions in 1927 found no meteorite fragments, just microscopic silicate and magnetite spheres in the soil. Some physicists proposed a rogue black hole or antimatter collision. More recently, NASA simulations suggest a stony asteroid 60 meters wide, vaporized instantly by atmospheric pressure. But here's where science and legend twist together like braided smoke. The explosion occurred at precisely 7:17 a.m. local time, an hour sacred to the Evenki when the veil between worlds is thinnest. The epicenter, directly above a geological anomaly where ancient volcanic pipes rich in diamonds stab upward through the crust, a place shamans called the navel of the earth. Even stranger, the blast pattern forms a perfect butterfly shape, its wings aligned with magnetic north. Coincidence possibly, but in 2007, an Italian team discovered Lake Chico, a small body just 5 miles from ground zero. Sediment cores reveal it's exactly 100 years old, and its conical shape suggests an impact crater. The Tunguska event remains a Rorschach test for belief. Astrophysicists see a warning about planetary defense. UFO enthusiasts cite reports of strange lights in Russian skies days before the blast, the Evenki. They still leave trinkets in the hollows of shattered trees, whispering apologies to Ogdi. Perhaps the truth lies in the silence. A century later, the scar in the taiga is healing young pines pushing through the ashes. But walk those woods at dawn when the mist curls like smoke and you might hear it, a low hum in the earth as if the land itself remembers the day the sky fell. Whether it was a rock from space or a god's clenched fist, Tunguska's real lesson lingers. The universe operates on scales we can't always comprehend, and sometimes the only difference between a scientific anomaly and a divine act is who's telling the story. The trees don't argue, they just grow. The Baltic Sea was black as ink on the night of January 30th, 1945, not just from winter's grip, but from the sheer density of humanity crammed aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff. The former cruise liner, once a symbol of Nazi leisure, now groaned under the weight of over 10,000 souls, wounded soldiers, terrified civilians, and countless children clutching dolls as the Soviet army closed in from the east. Few noticed the 3 torpedoes streaking through the water until the hull shuddered, then split like a rotten melon. What followed wasn't just a maritime disaster. It was history's deadliest sinking, a tragedy so vast it defies moral calculus. To understand the Gustloff's fate, you must first grasp the chaos of Operation Hannibal, the Nazis' desperate evacuation of East Prussia as Stalin's forces advanced. Panicked families fled across frozen lagoons, their wagons sinking into ice cracked by distant artillery. The Gustloff, painted white with red crosses but armed with anti-aircraft guns, became a floating paradox, part hospital ship, part military transport. Survivors like Heinz Schern, then a young naval officer, recalled the ship's corridors so packed people slept standing up, their breath frosting the portholes. When the torpedoes struck, the stampede for lifeboats crushed hundreds before they even reached the decks. Mothers dropped babies into the frozen water, hoping someone below might catch them. Most didn't. Here's where history twists the knife. The Soviet submarine captain who fired the fatal shots, Alexander Marinsko, was later court-martialed for drunkenness, his actions that night deemed reckless, not heroic. Yet in Russia, he's celebrated as the man who avenged Nazi atrocities, his torpedoes delivering cosmic payback for Leningrad's siege. The Gustloff's sinking killed 6 times more than the Titanic, yet remains a footnote in Western memory. Why? Perhaps because the victims were mostly German, their stories tangled in the war's moral fog. Debates still rage. Was this retribution? The Gustloff's namesake, a Nazi assassinated by a Jewish student in 1936, had been memorialized as a martyr. The ship itself had once hosted Hitler Youth rallies, but does that justify drowning thousands of refugees, many just days old? Survivor Eva Bodenstein, who lost her entire family that night, put it bluntly: the children didn't choose the war. The water didn't ask who he voted for. The Baltic keeps its secrets. When divers finally reached the wreck in the 1990s, they found toys scattered across the seabed. A tiny shoe, a porcelain doll's face staring blankly upward. The ship lies in 3 pieces, as if broken by some giant hand. Above the surface, the waves show nothing. No oil slicks, no floating debris. Just the occasional seagull circling where, 79 years ago, 9,000 voices were swallowed by the dark. Maybe the real curse isn't in the sinking, but in the silence that followed, the way tragedy and justice can look identical, depending on which shore you stand. The tower's stones rained down like hailstones that day in Siloam, crushing 18 souls beneath its rubble, not soldiers or criminals, but ordinary men drawing water from the pool. When word of the tragedy reached Jesus, his response stunned his listeners. Do you think those who died were worse sinners than anyone else? In a culture where suffering was often seen as divine punishment, his words sliced through centuries of superstition. The Tower of Siloam wasn't a targeted strike from heaven, he insisted. It was simply a tower that fell. Ancient Jewish texts reveal how deeply tragedy was moralized. The Book of Job wrestles with this very question: why do the innocent suffer? Only to conclude that God's ways are unknowable. Yet by Jesus' time, the belief had hardened. Calamity meant guilt. When Pontius Pilate slaughtered Galilean pilgrims in the temple, mixing their blood with sacrificial animals, Luke 13:1, many assumed they'd committed some hidden sacrilege. The Tower of Siloam's collapse triggered the same whispers. Had its victims worked on the Sabbath, cheated their neighbors, the urge to find meaning in chaos is human, but Jesus flipped the script. His lesson: focus not on why others suffer, but on your own readiness to face life's fragility. Archaeology adds eerie context. Excavations near Jerusalem's Old City reveal that Siloam's tower stood atop a network of shaky aqueducts, a structural flaw waiting to fail. Its builders, likely rushing to expand Herod's grand projects, may have cut corners. If so, the real sin wasn't divine wrath, but human negligence. Modern parallels abound. When a bridge collapses or a pandemic strikes, we still scramble to blame corrupt officials, unvaccinated populations, even cultural decay. Yet Siloam's ruins whisper a different truth. Sometimes tragedy is just physics meeting poor planning. The tower's legacy isn't in its fall, but in the question it forces us to confront. Do we seek comfort in assigning blame, or do we, like those long-ago listeners, dare to accept that randomness governs more than we'd like to admit? The stones of Siloam still lie where they fell, silent witnesses to a truth as unsettling now as it was 2,000 years ago. Disaster doesn't discriminate. And neither, perhaps, should we. The wedding feast had lasted deep into the night, the air thick with fermented mare's milk and the scent of looted Frankish perfumes. Attila the Hun, the man who'd carved an empire from horseback and left a trail of smoldering cities from Constantinople to Gaul, lay sprawled across his bridal bed, not in drunken stupor, but in a pool of his own blood. The scourge of God, as the Romans called him, had met an end so absurdly anticlimactic, even his enemies hesitated to believe it a nosebleed, or was it? By dawn, whispers snaked through the camp like smoke. This was no ordinary death. This was divine reckoning dressed as chance. Medieval chroniclers wasted no time spinning moral fables. Bishop Hydatius, writing just years after the event in 453, called Attila's death the putrid fruit of his crimes finally rotting. The Byzantine historian Priscus, who dined with Attila years earlier, noted the warlord's habit of bragging that his sword was the only god he acknowledged. Now that same sword hung useless on the tent pole as his followers slashed their faces in grief, their blood mingling with their leaders in the dirt. The timing, too, felt scripted by higher powers. Attila had just married the Germanic princess Ildiko, his latest bride in a string of forced unions. Some said she was the one who'd slit his throat in revenge, others that he'd choked on his own excess. But the nosebleed version persisted, passed down like a punchline to humble tyrants. The conqueror who'd made rivers change course with corpses felled by a trickle from his own nostrils. Yet dig deeper and the story darkens. The Huns, fearing their leader's corpse would become a trophy, buried him in triple coffins. One iron, one silver, one gold, then diverted a river to hide the grave. Every slave who dug the trench was slaughtered to keep its location secret. Even nature seemed to recoil. Legend claims the grass where Attila bled out never grew again. Later Christian writers, like the 6th century Gregory of Tours, would frame his death as proof that no man escapes the ledger of heaven. But perhaps the most haunting detail comes from the Huns themselves. Their shamans spoke of the sky's blade, an invisible force that cuts down even the mightiest when their arrogance finally tips the scales. Modern historians offer tamer theories: esophageal rupture from years of heavy drinking or a freak hemorrhage from hypertension. But the symbolism lingers. Attila's empire disintegrated within months of his death, his sons butchering each other for scraps. The man who'd boasted, "Where my horse steps, grass dies," left behind a wasteland even the weeds refused to reclaim. Whether by biology or divinity, his end carried the crisp finality of a door slamming shut, not with the roar of battle, but with the quiet, sticky sound of blood hitting the floor. The Huns rode on, but their terror died with him that night, and the world, breathing easier, remembered no scourge lasts forever, not even gods. The first explosion tore apart the morning of August 26, 1883, with a sound heard 2,000 miles away, a thunderclap so monstrous, sailors in the Indian Ocean checked their charts, convinced a naval battle raged nearby. But this was no man-made war. This was Krakatoa, the volcanic island between Java and Sumatra, waking from its slumber with the fury of 1,000 angry gods. By the next day, the island had vanished in a series of eruptions so violent, they triggered tsunamis that swallowed entire coastal villages and turned the sky the color of dried blood. To the Dutch colonists recording measurements, it was a geological catastrophe. To the Sundanese people who'd long whispered that the mountain was the prison of a vengeful spirit named Batara Kala, it was something far older, divine retribution for humanity's arrogance. Local legends had warned of this moment for generations. Villages near the Sunda Strait spoke of a time when the earth would spit fire until the sea boiled and the sun hid in shame. Dutch officials dismissed these tales as primitive superstition, even as their barometers shattered from the pressure waves and their telegraph lines melted from airborne heat. Yet when the final eruption, 4 times more powerful than the largest nuclear bomb ever detonated, vaporized 2/3 of the island, even the most skeptical European minds faltered. The tsunamis that followed weren't just waves, they were walls of black water, some over 100 feet tall, scouring the coastline clean of everything from Javanese fishing huts to colonial lighthouses. Over 36,000 people died in a single afternoon, their bodies washing ashore for weeks as the ocean coughed them back up. The aftermath played out like a clash between ancient prophecy and modern science. For months, the planet's skies burned crimson at dusk, a spectacle immortalized in Edvard Munch's The Scream, his swirling blood-red horizon inspired by Norwegian sunsets tinted by Krakatoa's ash. Global temperatures dropped by over 2 degrees Fahrenheit, triggering freak snowfalls in New England and failed harvests across Europe. Victorian scientists scrambled to explain these phenomena with charts and barometric readings, while Javanese shamans performed cleansing rituals, insisting the eruptions would continue until the wrongs of the land were made right. The Dutch, meanwhile, blamed the volcano alone, conveniently ignoring how their forced cultivation policies had displaced thousands from fertile highlands to vulnerable coastal areas. Archaeological digs in modern Indonesia reveal eerie layers to the disaster. Beneath the ash, researchers found Javanese talismans buried in doorways, charms against mountain spirits left by families who'd heeded the old warnings too late. European settlements, by contrast, showed no such preparations. Their ruins held only shattered crockery and pocket watches stopped at the exact moment the tsunamis hit. Even nature seemed to take sides. Areas where coral reefs had been left intact by local fishing traditions suffered less damage, the reefs acting as natural breakwaters against the killer waves. Today, Krakatoa's child, Anak Krakatau, grows taller each year in the caldera of its predecessor. Scientists monitor its tremors with satellites, while Sundanese fishermen still toss offerings of rice and flowers into the strait. The lesson here isn't just about plate tectonics versus folklore, it's about what happens when we dismiss stories etched into the land itself. Krakatoa didn't just reshape coastlines, it exposed the fault lines between knowledge and wisdom. The volcanoes will always speak. The question is, who's listening? The crate arrived in Chicago under a false label, agricultural samples, but the weight was all wrong. When Egyptologist James Henry pried it open in 1920, the stench of cedar oil and ancient rot poured out. Inside lay a golden asp coiled as if ready to strike, its emerald eyes flickering in the dim warehouse light. The serpent had been smuggled from a newly excavated tomb near Thebes, its provenance deliberately obscured. Breasted knew the risks. Egypt's antiquities laws were tightening, and curses followed stolen relics like shadows. But the University of Chicago needed a showstopper for its new Oriental Institute. He signed the paperwork anyway. Within weeks, the whispers began. A night watchman claimed the statue shifted position behind its glass case, its fangs glistening with fresh venom. Then the death started. Breasted's photographer, a skeptic who joked about mummy's curse melodrama, developed a necrotic wound on his hand after handling the artifact. Doctors diagnosed a rare infection, but the man's last words, "It burns like the serpent's kiss," sent chills through the institute. Next, the team's lead translator collapsed mid-lecture, his throat swelling shut as he gasped about, "A rope tightening around my neck." Autopsies found no poison, only baffling references in their notes to dreams of a hooded figure whispering in Demotic. Rationalists pointed to the obvious. Egypt's deserts teemed with venomous snakes, and tomb robbers often fell victim to lingering toxins or bacterial spores. The asp statue, they argued, was just a macabre focus for superstition. But then came the journal entries. Breasted himself wrote of waking to find his bedsheets knotted like a noose, his wrists marked with faint puncture wounds. His wife reported hearing scales slithering across their hardwood floors, a sound that vanished the moment she lit a lamp. The final straw, the institute's janitor, a man who'd never entered the exhibit hall, was found dead in his basement apartment, his skin mottled with zigzagging bruises resembling snake scales. The university quietly returned the artifact to Egypt in 1924. The though records show it never made it back to Thebes. Some claim it sits in a private collection. Others insist it was sealed inside a lead-lined vault beneath the Nile's floodplain. As for Breasted, he lived another decade, but colleagues noted he never again worked with serpent iconography. His last published paper contained a single cryptic line: "The ancients did not curse their treasures. They merely warned us about ourselves." Perhaps the most chilling footnote comes from modern toxicology. In 2018, researchers analyzing residue from other stolen Egyptian relics identified a neurotoxin derived from Serast's vipers, a venom that causes hallucinations of being strangled by snakes before inducing paralysis. Coincidence? Almost certainly, but in the archives of the Oriental Institute, one folder remains locked. Its label reads simply, "Asp Incident, do not open." The storm hit without warning off the coast of Cape Cod, transforming the sea into a churning abyss. The Whydah, a 100-ton pirate ship laden with stolen ivory, gold, and indigo, shuddered as waves taller than her mast slammed against her hull. Captain Samuel "Black Sam" Bellamy, the so-called Prince of Pirates, had evaded the British Navy for months, but on that April night in 1717, nature itself seemed to rise against him. By dawn, the Whydah lay shattered on the seabed, her treasure scattered, her crew drowned. Of the 146 souls aboard, only 2 washed ashore alive. To pious New Englanders, it was divine intervention. To the pirates who'd terrorized the Atlantic, it was a grim punchline to their own ballads of invincibility. Bellamy's story reads like a cosmic irony. Just weeks before the wreck, he'd captured the Whydah, a former slave ship, and turned her into a floating palace of plunder. His crew, a motley brotherhood of escaped slaves, indentured servants, and outcasts, had voted him captain for his fairness. Unlike other pirates who ruled by cruelty, Bellamy shared loot equally and forbade torture. Yet his mercy didn't extend to the merchant vessels he plundered. Survivors told of his crew's taunts as they burned ships, their laughter carrying over the waves as they toasted the devil's luck. That luck ran out near Wellfleet, Massachusetts, where the Whydah's wreck coincided with a violent nor'easter, a storm locals called the Hand of God clearing the waters. The wreck's aftermath drips with symbolism. Bellamy's body washed up in a tidal pool, his pistol still strapped to his waist, as if even death couldn't disarm him. The ship's bell, engraved with the phrase, "The Whydah Galley 1716, was found buried in sand, its clapper rusted silent, most haunting the cargo. Gold coins meant to buy slaves fused into grotesque lumps by the force of the sinking, as if the metal itself refused to be spent. For centuries, the wreck was considered a myth until divers in 1984 discovered her remains, including over 200,000 artifacts. Among them, a leg bone still encased in a silk stocking and a cannon wedged into the seabed, aimed skyward like an accusing finger. Pirate lore spun the disaster into legend. Some claimed Bellamy had been warned by a Jamaican fortune teller that the sea would claim what he loved most. Others swore they'd seen the Whydah's ghost ship sailing backward against the wind, her decks manned by skeletons. Even the sole surviving crewman, Thomas Davis, spoke of a final omen, the ship's parrot, which had squawked King Death moments before the mast snapped. Historians offer humbler explanations: overloaded holds, inexperienced sailors, and the Cape's treacherous sandbars. But consider this: the Whydah sank near a stretch of coast once called the Graveyard of the Atlantic, where currents conspired to drag ships under. Bellamy's final raid, a wealthy trader bound for Boston with church silver. The storm struck as he sailed north to visit his lover, Maria Hallett, a woman locals later branded a witch for cursing fishermen. Coincidence piles upon coincidence until it starts to feel like design. The Whydah's wreckage still surfaces in shifting sands, her treasures now displayed in Provincetown museums. Visitors run their fingers over melted gold and wonder, Was this a shipwreck or a reckoning? The sea, as always, keeps its secrets, but sometimes, just sometimes, the waves toss back a clue, like the ship's bell, now silent, that once rang for both plunder and punishment. The streets of Beijing had never been louder than on that spring morning in 1626. Merchants hawked their wares, children chased each other through narrow alleys, and the imperial capital pulsed with life, until the ground itself seemed to erupt. A deafening roar shattered the skyline as the Wanggongchang Armory, stocked with enough gunpowder to supply the Ming dynasty's armies for years, ignited in a fireball visible for miles. Windows shattered across the city, roofs collapsed like paper lanterns, and a mushroom cloud of black smoke blotted out the sun. When the dust settled, 20,000 lay dead, not soldiers, but ordinary citizens, their bodies scattered like broken dolls across what came to be called the District of the Dead. To the survivors, this wasn't an accident. It was the heavens screaming. The Ming dynasty, once a golden age, had been rotting from within. Emperor Changqi, a recluse more interested in carpentry than governance, had let the eunuch Wei Zhongxian turn the court into a den of corruption. Taxes crippled peasants while the elite hoarded grain. Just months before the explosion, a drought had parched northern China, and famine stalked the land like a ghost. The armory blast occurring on the 5th day of the 5th month, a date long associated with cosmic balance in Chinese tradition, felt like a celestial ledger snapping shut. The emperor's response was a masterclass in political theater. Clad in mourning robes, he walked barefoot through the ruins, prostrating himself before makeshift altars to beg forgiveness from heaven. His edict of repentance blamed his own lack of virtue for the disaster, promising sweeping reforms. But the subtext was clear. By framing the catastrophe as divine punishment for collective moral failure rather than governmental negligence, he deftly shifted responsibility onto the people themselves. The move temporarily quelled unrest, but the cracks in the Ming's legitimacy were irreversible. Within 18 years, rebel armies would storm the Forbidden City, and the last Ming emperor would hang himself from a locust tree as Manchurian forces breached the gates. Historians note eerie details about the blast's aftermath. The explosion left a crater 3 miles wide, yet somehow spared a single building, a shrine to Guan Yu, the god of loyalty and justice. Nearby, a stone tablet engraved with Confucian virtues stood upright amidst the rubble. Its message, "He who rules by virtue is like the North Star, miraculously unscathed." Even the gunpowder's origin carried symbolic weight. It had been stockpiled during the reign of Wanli, an earlier emperor whose extravagance drained the treasury, a buried sin literally detonating decades later. Modern seismologists estimate the blast at 2 to 3 kilotons, rivaling a small nuclear device. Chemical analysis suggests stored nitrate compounds may have degraded into unstable crystals, but survivors needed no lab reports. They'd seen the fireball take the shape of a dragon before dissipating, an omen so potent even the emperor's propaganda couldn't fully contain it. The Wanggongchang disaster became shorthand for a dynasty's unraveling, a warning etched in blood and gunpowder. When rulers mistake power for mandate, even the earth itself may rebel. Today, the site lies beneath a busy Beijing intersection, but locals still avoid walking there after dark. Some say the air smells faintly of sulfur when the wind blows just right, or that on especially quiet nights you can hear the echo of 1,000,000 firecrackers, celebrating not a festival but a reckoning. The bricks were still warm from the kiln when the murmurs began, whispers of a tower so tall it would scrape the heavens themselves. According to Genesis, humanity once spoke a single language, united not just by words but by ambition. Their project, a city with a ziggurat reaching unto the sky, a monument to their own collective might. But as the mortar dried between those baked bricks, the story takes a sharp turn. God confounds their language, scattering the people across the earth like seeds in the wind. What reads as divine punishment raises haunting questions. Was this a cruel joke or a mercy in disguise? archaeology paints a vivid backdrop. The Tower of Babel wasn't just myth. It was likely inspired by real Mesopotamian ziggurat step temples like Etimenanki in Babylon, where priests climbed staircases to commune with the gods. These structures weren't just architectural feats, they were political statements. Kings like Nebuchadnezzar II rebuilt ziggurats as symbols of control, boasting inscriptions like, "I raised the summit to rival the heavens." The biblical scribes, likely writing during the Babylonian exile, would have seen these towers as taunts humanity's arrogance stacked layer by layer, yet the story's brilliance lies in its irony. The people sought unity through brick and bitumen, but true destruction came not from crumbling masonry, it came from the very tool they'd used to collaborate, language. Suddenly, "let us make bricks" became meaningless noise. Construction halted not because the work was impossible, but because the workers couldn't agree on what impossible even meant. Theologians debate whether this was punishment or protection, a curb on human potential or a safeguard against worse collective sins. After all, a monolingual world had already pooled its ingenuity for vanity. What might they have weaponized next? Modern parallels resonate. The ziggurat's shadow stretches into Silicon Valley skyscrapers, political propaganda, even AI labs where engineers speak in code the public can't decipher. The fear isn't just of reaching too high, it's of losing ourselves in the climb. Linguists note how language still divides us today. Untranslatable words create chasms between cultures, while jargon builds ivory towers of exclusion. The Tower of Babel's real legacy might be its warning. Communication isn't just about understanding words, it's about agreeing on what's sacred. The ruins of Babylon's ziggurat now blend into the Iraqi desert, their grandeur reduced to mud and memory. But the story survives, not as a fossil but a mirror. Every time humanity rallies around a grand project, whether space colonies or social media empires, the old question lingers: are we building bridges or just taller towers? The bricks haven't changed, neither have we, and somewhere in the heavens the laughter might sound suspiciously like thunder. The snow was so deep it swallowed sound whole. When Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 clipped the Andes Ridge on October 13, 1972, the crash didn't just strand 45 passengers in the harshest wilderness on Earth, it stranded their souls in a moral wasteland. For 72 days, the survivors battled avalanches, starvation, and a question with no easy answer: how far would you go to live? The world would later fixate on the grisly details: bodies becoming rations, the improvised knives from scrap metal. But the real horror wasn't in the act of survival. It was in the silence afterward, when the rescued had to reconcile what they'd done with who they'd once believed themselves to be. These weren't hardened adventurers. They were young rugby players, medical students, devout Catholics raised on communion wafers and the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." Yet as the days blurred into weeks, their prayers for rescue turned into whispered debates over theology. Roberto Canessa, a pre-med student, argued that consuming the dead wasn't murder. It was communion, a sacred exchange where the fallen offered their flesh to save the living. Others, like Nando Parado, saw no divinity in it, only brutal arithmetic. No protein meant no strength to hike for help. The group's final decision came not with a vote, but with the slow, sickening realization that their rosaries wouldn't fill their stomachs. What haunts this story isn't the survival tactics, it's the spiritual aftershocks. After their miraculous rescue, some survivors confessed to priests, expecting excommunication. Instead, they were absolved under the principle of necessity, a theological loophole stating that extreme circumstances can suspend moral laws. The Church's leniency sparked outrage among traditionalists who saw it as a slippery slope. Newspaper editorials asked, if you could bend the rules for cannibalism, where did it end? Meanwhile, psychologists noted something stranger. Many survivors felt more connected to their faith afterward. Eduardo Strauch, one of the last to leave the wreckage, described it as walking through hell to find God waiting on the other side. The Andes disaster forced a reckoning far beyond Catholicism. Bioethicists still cite it when debating starvation crimes, while Everest climbers and lifeboat survivors quietly acknowledge its uncomfortable truths. Perhaps the deepest lesson lies in the wreckage itself, the way the plane's white fuselage, half buried in snow, became both tomb and lifeline. The survivors didn't just eat the dead, they carried them home in their bones, metabolizing their memories along with their muscle. In the end, the real miracle wasn't that they lived, it's that they forgave themselves enough to call it living. The sun did not rise over Amarna so much as it hunted. Akhenaten, the self-proclaimed living Aten, had ripped Egypt's spiritual heart from Thebes and replanted it in this barren crescent of desert, where colossal statues of himself and his alien-looking queen, Nefertiti, cast elongated shadows over a city built in a single frenzied decade. The pharaoh's revolution wasn't just political, it was cosmic. He declared war on Amun-Ra, king of the gods, shuttering temples, chiseling the deity's name from monuments, and redirecting the priesthood's wealth to his one true god, a faceless solar disk called the Aten, whose rays ended in tiny hands clutching Ankh symbols like a strangler's fingers. For 17 years, Egypt held its breath, then Akhenaten died, and the Nile itself seemed to exhale in rage. His successors acted with the precision of a curse fulfilled. Tutankhamun, likely his son, abandoned Amarna before his 10th birthday, restoring Amun's name and fleeing back to Thebes like a child retreating from a burning house. But the true reckoning came under Horemheb, the general-turned pharaoh who methodically erased Akhenaten from history. Temples were dismantled, their blocks reused like trash fill. Inscriptions were defaced, not just scratched out but pulverized, as if the very stone had offended the gods. Even Akhenaten's mummy vanished, likely dragged from its tomb and fed to crocodiles, the ultimate Egyptian damnation. To later scribes, he became the enemy, or simply that criminal. His reign excised from king lists as if the sun had blackened for a generation. Was this divine vengeance? The evidence chills. Amarna's royal tombs, hastily carved into unstable cliffs, collapsed inward, sealing Akhenaten's dynasty in a geological fist. The Aten temples, built from smaller, weaker sandstone blocks, a break from tradition meant to speed construction, crumbled faster than mud brick. Even the city's layout, a perfect semicircle mirroring the sun's path, became its own mockery when archaeologists found its eastern half had been built on shifting sand, swallowed by dunes within decades. Nature itself seemed to reject the heresy, yet politics whispered alongside theology. Akhenaten's revolution had bankrupted the priesthoods whose grain stores fed thousands. His focus on the Aten gutted festivals for Osiris, god of the afterlife, a spiritual betrayal that left commoners fearing their souls would starve. When plague swept through Amarna, a recently discovered mass grave held thousands, many children. It was seen not as misfortune but as Amun-Ra's breath rotting the land. Horemheb's restoration wasn't just piety, it was a PR campaign casting himself as the savior who drove out chaos, the eerie coda Tutankhamun's tomb. Though he'd renounced his father's heresy, his burial was shockingly modest, a cramped chamber stuffed with recycled furniture, his golden mask originally meant for Nefertiti. Some Egyptologists believe his early death was the curse at work, a boy king struck down for his bloodline sins. Others note his mummy's genetic defects, a clubfoot, cleft palate, and wonder if the gods weren't punishing Akhenaten's incestuous marriages. Either way, the message was clear: defy the cosmic order, and even gold won't buy your way into the afterlife. Today, Amarna's ruins bake under the same sun Akhenaten worshipped. The only intact Aten temple lies not in Egypt but in Berlin's News Museum, a trophy of colonialism as much as archaeology. Perhaps that's the final irony. The heretic pharaoh's legacy survives only in exile, while along the Nile, Amun-Ra's temples still stand, their columns etched with the same lesson. Revolution fades, the gods endure, and the sand remembers every king foolish enough to think otherwise. The water pulled back first, a hissing retreat that left fish flapping on suddenly exposed sand. Along the beaches of Banda Aceh, children laughed and chased the stranded sea life, unaware the ocean was inhaling before it roared. Then came the sound of freight trains' growl mixed with something deeper, older, as the tsunami's first wave, taller than the palm trees, surged over the coastline. In minutes, entire villages dissolved into churning foam. Survivors who clawed their way to rooftops or tangled themselves in the high branches of banyan trees would later describe the same eerie detail. The water wasn't just violent, it was angry. Religious interpretations erupted like fissures in the disaster's wake. In predominantly Muslim Aceh, clerics pointed to the timing, December 26th, during Ramadan's final days, as divine rebuke for waning piety. One mosque in Lokangar stood untouched amidst leveled neighborhoods, its minaret a solitary finger pointing skyward. Pilgrims flocked there, whispering of Allah's mercy. Meanwhile, in Hindu-majority Tamil Nadu, fishermen spoke of the sea goddess Manimkal, reclaiming what was hers. Ancient texts warned of pralaya, the cyclical destruction of the world, and now here it was, etched in saltwater and shattered fishing boats. Thai Buddhists meditating on karma noted how luxury resorts built over mangrove forests that once buffered waves collapsed first, while stilted fishing villages fared better. Science framed it differently. The rupture of the Sunda megathrust fault had unzipped the seafloor for 800 miles, lifting a gigaton of water upward at highway speeds. Satellite data showed waves radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel, their paths bending around continents to drown shores as far as Africa. Yet even seismologists struggled to explain why some islands, like Simulu, suffered minimal damage despite being near the epicenter. Oral tradition saved them. A 1900 tsunami had seeded the phrase smong, a local term for the ocean's deadly withdrawal into folklore. When the water receded in 2004, elders recognized the omen and herded families uphill. Christian communities in Sri Lanka grappled with theodicy, how a loving God could permit 230,000 deaths. A statue of Jesus in Gola, arms outstretched, survived unscathed even as the church around it crumbled, fueling claims of miracle. But in the same breath, survivors recounted horrors that defied easy faith. A train called the Queen of the Sea swept off its tracks, killing nearly 2,000 in a single metallic tomb. The tsunami's aftermath became a mirror for humanity's best and worst. Looters raided jewelry stores in Phuket, while Acehnese guerrillas mid-civil war laid down arms to dig mass graves. Scientists installed early warning buoys, yet in Jakarta, clerics debated whether such technology insulted divine will. Perhaps the most haunting legacy lies in the children, like the baby 2004 found floating on a mattress, adopted by a bereaved couple who saw her survival as sacred balance. Today, memorials dot the coastline, rusted ships lodged in city squares, museums with walls carved with the names of the vanished. The waves receded, but the questions never did. Was this nature's fury or heavenly judgment? The answer depends on where you stand literally. In Aceh, rebuilt mosques bear plaques thanking God for the test. In Gola's train cemetery, rusted rails twist into question marks, and under the Indian Ocean, the tectonic plates grind on, indifferent to the stories we tell above. The Vatican's bells had barely finished tolling for Pope Paul VI when the cardinals shocked the world by electing Albino Luciani, the smiling, humble Bishop of Venice, as his successor. John Paul I took the throne in August 1978 with promises of reform, his warmth earning him the nickname the Smiling Pope. 33 days later, he was dead. The official announcement blamed a heart attack, but the timing, just before revealing sweeping changes to Vatican finances, left too many questions unanswered. From the moment his secretary discovered the body clutching papers in rigor mortis, the whispers began. Was this divine intervention cutting short a papacy deemed too radical, or something far darker? The inconsistencies piled up like unread missiles. No autopsy was performed, breaking centuries of tradition for papal deaths. The embalming happened overnight, erasing potential evidence. The Pope's personal belongings, including his glasses and slippers, vanished before his family could claim them. Most damning, the conflicting accounts of his death. His secretary initially claimed to have found him in bed with reading material, while the Vatican later stated he died at his desk. Even the dose of digitalis found in his system raised eyebrows. Had medicine been administered improperly or deliberately? Conspiracy theorists pounced. Some pointed to Luciani's planned investigation into the Banco Ambrosiano, the Vatican bank entangled with mafia money laundering. Its chairman, Roberto Calvi, would later be found hanging under London's Blackfriars Bridge, his pockets stuffed with cash and stones, a death-ruled suicide despite clear signs of foul play. Others cited the Pope's alleged clash with hardline cardinals over birth control and liberation theology. Then there was the Freemason angle documents surfaced claiming Luciani had a list of high-ranking Masons infiltrating the church ready to be purged. Religious scholars offer quieter but no less chilling theories. John Paul I had chosen his double name to honor his two reforming predecessors, John Roman 23 and Paul VI. Both had faced fierce opposition, John for convening Vatican Roman II, Paul for banning contraception. To traditionalists, Luciani's death at 33 days echoed Christ's earthly ministry, a warning against straying from orthodoxy. Even the weather fed the law. A freak thunderstorm raged over Rome the night he died, lightning striking St. Peter's Dome 3 times, a detail omitted from official Vatican records but witnessed by dozens of nuns praying in the square. Forensic experts counter that Luciani's health was fragile, chronic lung issues, exhaustion from the conclave, and the stress of sudden global scrutiny. The digitalis, a routine heart medication, the rushed burial, standard for a body decomposing in Rome's September heat. But try telling that to the old women who still leave flowers at his simple tomb in the Vatican grottos, or the priests who swear they've seen a ghostly figure in white pacing the apostolic palace corridors. The church moved on. John Paul Roman II's long reign overshadowed his predecessor's brief flicker, but the questions never faded. Perhaps the most haunting clue lies in Luciani's own writings. Days before his death, he scribbled a note quoting Ezekiel, "I will pasture my sheep on the heights of Israel." The next line, left unwritten, reads, "I will seek the lost and bring back the strayed." Whether by human hands or divine design, history ensured he'd never get the chance. The smiling Pope's legacy endures not in reforms enacted, but in the shadows he briefly illuminated and the mysteries that outlived him. From the cursed tombs of Egypt to the smoking ruins of Pompeii, from the Arctic waters that swallowed the Titanic to the silent streets of Roanoke, these 30 stories echo with a single, haunting refrain: humanity's instinct to see the hand of the divine in chaos. We crave patterns, justice, meaning in the wreckage. When plagues spare the pious and tyrants meet grotesque ends, it's comforting to believe the universe keeps score. But dig deeper and a paradox emerges. The same cultures that invented these tales of divine retribution were often destroyed by the very forces they claimed their gods controlled. The Babylonians, who feared Marduk's wrath, drowned in floods their own deforestation caused. The Anasazi, who whispered of spirit curses, collapsed under drought they'd exacerbated by overbuilding. Even the Titanic's unsinkable arrogance mirrored an Edwardian faith in progress that world war I would soon shatter. Perhaps these stories endure not because they're true, but because they're mirrors. When we describe God's punishing hubris, we're really confessing our own fear of overreach. When we spin curses from coincidences, we admit how little control we have. And when we rewrite history as moral fables, Croesus misunderstanding oracles, Sodom falling for cruelty, we reveal something raw. The the hope that somewhere, somehow, the universe cares enough to punish and protect. Now it's your turn. Have you ever witnessed what felt like supernatural justice? A politician felled by scandal after mocking the poor, a bully struck by karma so precise it defied logic. Or do you see these stories as psychological safeguard, a way to cope with life's randomness? The comment section is open and I'll be reading every theory. Because here's the final, unsettling question these 30 tales leave us with. Do we shape the divine to fit our fears, or does it shape us? The ruins are waiting. The answer is yours. Why do we keep telling these stories? Why does every culture, from ancient Mesopotamia to modern Hollywood, spin tales of cosmic payback? The answer lies in the wiring of our own minds, a tangled web of biases, fears, and deep-seated needs that transform chaos into justice. Our brains are pattern-seeking machines, ruthlessly efficient at connecting dots even when no lines exist. When a hurricane flattens a corrupt politician's mansion or a thief's getaway car crashes into a church, we don't see coincidence, we see design. Psychologists call this just world bias, the stubborn belief that the universe must balance its books, that suffering is never random but always earned. It's the same instinct that makes us whisper karma when a bully slips on ice or a tyrant chokes on his own feast, but there's more at play than cognitive shortcuts. These stories function as societal glue, reinforcing moral codes sharper than any logbook. Think of the Greek nemesis, the Hindu dharma, the biblical eye for an eye, all variations on a theme: behave or the cosmos will collect. When Aesop's tortoise beats the hare or Shakespeare's Macbeth dies howling of his guilt, we're not just entertained, we're conditioned. Anthropologists argue that pre-literate cultures used oral traditions as preventive medicine, their cautionary tales inoculating listeners against greed, pride, and betrayal. A peasant might not fear the king's soldiers, but the idea that lightning could strike him dead for stealing his neighbor's goat, that kept the peace. Yet beneath the moralizing lurks something darker, our terror of helplessness. Natural disasters, pandemics, random violence, these remind us how little control we truly have. But if we can reframe tragedy as punishment, suddenly there's logic to the madness. The Lisbon earthquake of 1755 wasn't just tectonic plates shifting, it was God's verdict on a sinful city. The Black Death wasn't fleas on rats, it was divine wrath for humanity's wickedness. Even today, conspiracy theorists mold chaos into narrative, insisting school shootings or plane crashes must be false flags because the alternative, that horrors happen without reason, is unbearable. Here's the twist: these stories often backfire. When we interpret suffering as divine retribution, we license cruelty. Medieval flagellants whipped themselves to atone for plague victims' sins. Puritans hanged witches to cleanse their towns of God's displeasure. Modern demagogues still blame hurricanes on LGBTQ+ communities or claim school shootings punish secularism. The line between myth and weapon grows perilously thin. So where does that leave us? These tales endure because they're mirrors reflecting not celestial justice, but our own hunger for order in a universe that owes us none. They're the campfire stories of a species terrified of the dark, whispering to ourselves that the monsters only eat the wicked, and maybe that's the most human thing of all. Stay tuned, because next time we're diving deeper into the science of supernatural belief. From the agent detection that makes us see faces in clouds to the eerie comfort of believing our ancestors or watching the psychology of the unseen is stranger than any myth. Until then, keep questioning. The truth, like justice, rarely wears the face we expect.